Very happy and excited to have Julia Steinberger with us as today's opening keynote. Julia has a PhD in physics from MIT and made key contribution to industrial ecology before ending up as one of the leading ecological economists today. She's professor of societal challenges of climate change at the University of Lausanne and was a lead author for the sixth assessment report for the IPCC's Working Group 3. She was also a recipient of the Leverhulme Research Leadership Award for her project Living Well Within Limits, investigating how universal well-being may be achieved within planetary boundaries. And she currently co-leads the 10 million ERC Synergy Grant REAL, a post-growth deal, advancing scientific research for realizing post-growth transformations. Now, Julia is one of these rare academics who walk the talk on all levels and is a constant source of inspiration and insight in the struggle for a livable, sustainable, and just world. So please join me in welcoming Julia Steinberger.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the introduction, Fabian. I feel like even through the screen, I can see you actually quite well, and I sort of recognize some people, and I'm sort of afraid that quite a few, there's a bunch of sort of generic sort of old things in this talk, but there's some things that might be a bit new. So I'm hoping that you won't be bored by the generic old things, and I'm hoping that we get to the new stuff, and then I'm hoping that we have a really interesting discussion. So I've built in lots of time for discussion, and since this is a rather small group, I don't even know, like maybe we can even do discussion during the talk if somebody wants to. Okay, so off we go, if it lets me go. So basically, one of the things that Fabian asked me to do is to go over the overarching results of this Living Well Within Limits project. And we basically, so it's currently in review, we basically published, it turned out we had a lot of different results coming out, and then people were sort of confused and saying, like, where's where's the one paper we can read to just learn about everything and then not have to read, like, 30 papers. So we basically came up with the way of telling the project in 10 stylized facts. And so so this is sort of the overarching summary of what our research came up with in the Living Well Within Limits. And this is a paper that you can find on the preprint server. And I'm just going to focus on a few of these stylized facts in the talk, because otherwise, like, it's going to take us too long. And if you're interested in seeing more and having more references and also to other literature, just go and look for that paper, and hopefully that will be interesting. Okay, so just some, climate change context. We're hitting for cataclysm. We're already, somewhere in the order of 1.5 degrees. And this means that we really have to do things what we can now. Obviously, some things are going in the right direction, way more going in the wrong direction in terms of, everything, really. So it's a very interesting time to be alive, which obviously is not necessarily a good thing. And yesterday I was talking to a science journalist from actually a really good science journalist outfit in Switzerland, and he had never heard of the most important tipping point for our geographic region. So I thought I would start with that. Maybe I can ask you guys, what is the single most important planetary tipping point for our geographic region, let's say in Northern Europe? And you're more north than I am right this second. I'm in Switzerland. Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, he'd never heard of it, so that's kind of terrifying. So the AMOC is the North Atlantic, it's a northern, I don't know any oceanography, right? But it's the North Atlantic overturning of the ocean current. Warm water arrives at the level of Greenland, sinks to the bottom, and then cools down. And it's a really important mechanism for distributing energy worldwide on the planet. And that is looking more and more likely to shut down at very low heating temperatures, well within the range of what our current policy trajectory is taking us to this century, or even during this century. And it's going to cool down Northern Europe massively. So you see this sort of the map of the world with this sort of blue dot. That is cooling. So we have global heating, but the heating is disrupting planetary energy redistribution. And so you have this massive cooling right on, Greenland and mostly Northern Europe. And this is the plot that really sort of keeps me up at night, is the one on, and also it heats up the rest of the world. So basically you get this cool spot in the North Atlantic, but then everything else heats up by like an extra fraction, large fraction of a degree, which is obviously cataclysmic. And then what is the extent of the sea ice. And I think that's a graph that sort of shows the extent of the sea ice in February, and an intermediate emission scenario and AMA collapse. And so these are very recent results, and so I don't think anybody has at all grappled with how catastrophic this is. But I think it reaches down to the Netherlands. It certainly covers quite a bit of the UK, and all of Scandinavia. So that's kind of terrifying. So that's what we're up against in terms of physical impacts. And so now we need to think about how we change our socioeconomic systems in order to do things differently. So my research is focused very much on the socioeconomic systems, right? So let's think about that. So I come from physics, from natural science. And so the first thing in natural science and physics is energy. And energy is also a good proxy for resource use in general. Oh yes, and from industrial ecology, one of the things to, like, if you have to understand one core thing from industrial ecology, which is the topic of how societies and economies use resources, is that the commitment for environmental impact happens at the moment of extraction. The time when you are deciding that you are going to be committing to destroying the environment happens at the point of extraction. It's not an end of pipe problem. It's a beginning. It's a demand from the environment problem, right? And so what that means is that we have to think about our resource use and our resource demand from the very beginning in terms of the scale of resource demand. And so the first thing I was trying to understand was looking at energy. And when you look at energy use, you're also looking at a proxy for a lot of environmental impacts, especially since our energy is so fossil fueled. But that's also another topic that we can talk about. Okay, so the first thing I want to try to understand was some, how much energy do we need? How much energy do we need to be well? And so these are some things that have been known for a while, okay? Like, we're talking about old results, but in case you haven't seen them before, here are some stylized facts on energy and well-being. The first one is the high plateau. This has been known forever, as long as I've been alive. In fact, this paper was published the year of my birth. Massive energy consumption may not be necessary to maintain current living standards in America, and that was published in 1974. And so basically that means that beyond a certain level, you just don't get anything. And we see it in the data. This is a figure that I like because it launched my career. When I saw it, I was like, oh shit, I need to be studying this. This is fascinating. It shows the Human Development Index versus electricity use in kilowatt hours per capita. But it actually really doesn't matter what you put on the vertical axis as a well-being indicator. It doesn't matter what you put as an energy use indicator per capita on the horizontal axis. This plot always looks the same. It always has a steep slope to start with. A little gets you a long way. And then as energy goes up, it just does not matter anymore. And you really have, orders of magnitude difference between the countries doing well at low energy and the countries doing also well at high energy. It just does not matter. Okay, so that's an interesting thing to realize. A little goes a long way. If you don't have very much, a lot doesn't matter anymore. The second stylized fact, which is something that that was something that I stumbled upon. I was actually not the first person to stumble upon it, but I was the first person to sort of try to publish it prominently and sort of really quantify what it meant, is that the energy threshold associated with any given level of well-being decreases over time. And again, this is true of any kind of energy metric or well-being metric. And so what that means is that and this is sort of the summary plot. So now the axes have flipped. I hope you're complexity scientists, hopefully, so you can read graphs pretty fast. So energy use per capita is now on the vertical axis. This is in gigajoules of probably primary energy. And time on the horizontal axis. And I had data back when I did this study, I had data back until 2005, okay? But one can do a data update of this. This is all going to show very much the same pattern. And what this means is that the energy required for well-being or associated with high well-being in 1975, it would be the dark green curve and would be way above what we were actually using in terms of energy, which is the black line. But because the energy associated with high well-being is crashing down over time, as you see the green line do, we actually have enough energy now. So now we're in a question, it's a question of redistribution, and it's a question of maybe reducing demand. But basically we've really changed during, sometime during the 1990s, it became possible with the current energy supply to achieve high human development for everybody. So that's interesting. Okay, so that's an interesting thing. But then if we want to go beyond that, we have to look at a different way of doing things. And the way we do this is we study, so this is hopefully something that maybe in the complexity sense is potentially an interesting thing in terms of a framework to study how you would connect biophysical inputs. So there's planetary processes and the natural resources that drive them, and social outcomes on the right-hand side, where we have well-being and need satisfiers, right? And so in the middle, what we did, that was one of the big innovations for our project, is we decided to use this concept of provisioning systems, or this object of provisioning systems, which comes from heterodox economics, not mainstream economics. And it really views the economy not as a flat market, but as sort of vertical, sectoral provisioning systems. So basically, you're trying to understand how you're providing different aspects of products and commodities in the economy, and you're trying to understand them both in physical, social, economic, et cetera, terms. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. And the first thing is obviously we have to understand well-being a bit, and I think at this point that there are a lot of people who study well-being from a lot of different perspectives. I think what we do is less controversial than what it was. I think it's more accepted, but I'm still going to walk you through it because probably some people aren't familiar with these different frameworks. Okay, so, and I'm going to give you the cartoon version, which if there's any philosopher in the audience, they will hate it, because you have to, in our tradition, we go back to ancient Greece. We have different people thinking about well-being. We have Aristotle, who's talking about flourishing, living life as fully as possible. It's a very social perspective. And then just a few decades later, Epicure comes on the scene, and he says he has a much more individual-focused perspective, much more interior-looking perspective. And again, this is a cartoon version, but there's this idea of the most positive and the least negative feelings possible, this idea of balance. So it's individual and sort of optimizing. And as in good academic disputes, everything persists, keeps on going. And the team, the Epicure team, this is something that Epicure, a lot of Epicure would have vehemently disagreed with and been very upset about. But these are sort of where his ideas ended up in our present day. We have this perspective of well-being that's emotional happiness. It's focused on the individual. We're measuring it most usually it's measured with a single dimension indicator, like happiness, or if you're a mainstream economist, utility, like a utility function, which is a thing that's supposed to exist. And then what your view of the economy is very much oriented by this utility perspective, or this happiness perspective, because in the mainstream economic perspective, we increase our happiness and our well-being when we spend money in the market. That's the way we do things. If we want to be happy, is we spend money in the market. We have a given budget. Some people have more budget, some people have less. Too bad, so sad. And then people choose how to maximize their utility, maximize their happiness by spending money in the economy. And that means that from that perspective, if that's your framework for thinking about things, economic growth is positive, because more income results in more consumption, results in more positive feelings. Bingo, growth is great. All right, if you're team Aristotle, then you have to have a very different perspective. It's and this is very much a minority perspective right now, right? This is not the dominant perspective in our societies and our policy making. Your perspective is around flourishing. It's a social perspective. You're talking about well-being not being something that's possible individually, but something that has to be, thought about at the level of community and society. You're generally looking at multiple dimensional indicators, even if they're sometimes brought together. So I would say that the Human Development Index and the Sustainable Development Goals are already going in this direction of being more towards Aristotle, because they're at least saying human well-being has different aspects to it. You can't just look at just one thing. And the goal of the economy is very different. The goal of the economy is to support human potential. And that's what Amartya Sen and his capabilities framework is talking about. And it's what he talks about, for instance, in his book, Development is Freedom, is this idea that the economy should be supporting human potential, not, it's not like the goal of humans to be better worker bees for economic growth. The goal of the economy should be to support what we can do in our lives. And obviously, we're very much Team Aristotle, as you can tell from this totally unbiased presentation. and we wrote about this. And we wrote these papers so you don't have to read them. And there's actually a better one that came out, and I'll tell you about that one. Written by Leah Tamberg, so it's just published. So actually, I should be telling you about that one now because it's actually better. Okay, which actually brings together some of these perspectives. So if you're interested in a really nice synthetic literature review and causal framework analysis suitable for complexity scientists, look up Leah Tamberg's latest paper, and you will be very happy. Mm-hmm. Oh, no pun intended. Okay, so then we wanted to be able to test Aristotle's theory because it's nice to have a theory, but we're scientists, right? It's not just, and we're scientists and we're not mainstream economists, which means we like to test things empirically. So let's go and do that. So what we did is we based ourselves on the theory of human need of Doyle and Guff, and Ian Guff actually became a good friend and is now a member of the British Academy, so it's all fantastic. And so Ian Guff and Len Doyle put together this theory of human need, which is really trying to operationalize what societies should be doing to allow this development as freedom to happen, okay? And so they have these, the idea of human needs is that we have a finite number of non-substitutable, satisfiable, satiable human needs. There's a finite number of them. There's not like infinity. You can't just keep going. They're satiable and they're non-substitutable. That's the theory, okay? And the point being that once these multidimensional needs, think about a multi-legged bug. You have a multi-legged bug, right? Like an insect, or maybe it has a few more legs than 6, okay? But the way that a thing is a need, i.e. one of the legs, is that if one of the legs is harmed, injured, broken, that bug will not be able to walk well. So the way you define a need is by demonstration of harm if that need is not satisfied. So it's not like I need a chocolate ice cream or I need an SUV, because people are just going to be like, no, you kind of want those things. Maybe you've got good reasons or not. A need is something that harms your life chances if it is not satisfied, if it is not realized. It's a negative definition. All right, so off we go. So now we're looking for evidence of this. So basically, we're looking for empirical evidence that multidimensional need satisfaction is a precondition for well-being. And this was already in our 2018 paper led by Dan O'Neill. And so what we had is we had an international database where we had a well-being indicator of life satisfaction for different countries. And then we also had need satisfiers achieved for different countries, okay? And then we were like, okay, well, let's look how countries do in terms of life satisfaction versus the number of need satisfiers achieved. And the relationship looks like this, which is like, we were not expecting that. It looks crazy strong. And for physical well-being, so average healthy life expectancy, so physical health, it looks even stronger because you actually see something that looks a bit like saturation. Mm-hmm. So that was encouragement for us. Since then, Leah Tamberg, the same Leah Tamberg, but a different paper. This one is still in review. So we're going to try to get it back out the door soon, and it's currently on the preprint. It's also published as a preprint, so you can find it, but a final version will be coming soon. What Leah did is she had access not to international data, she had access to the Gallup World Poll data, which has like hundreds of people within countries. And so way, way, way more data. And what she was able to do was basically test for need satisfaction versus income. And the title of the paper says it all. Excuse me. Human need satisfaction enables decoupling of well-being from income. So normally, the normal state of the world is the blue curve, where you see that life evaluation versus GDP per capita. That's sort of the general, that's like if you're not taking need satisfaction into account. And you see this very strong correlation, sorry. The orange curve is if you say everybody's needs are satisfied on an individual level. And you see that the curve just pops up and flattens out. So the effect of GDP growth just becomes way less important. The orange curve is even more interesting because it's super high and it's totally flat, basically. And what it's doing is it's saying that individual needs are satisfied, but also you're in a good country and everybody, not just your needs are satisfied, but everybody else's needs are satisfied, and you've got some levels of good governance and democratic quality. So basically, that means that GDP growth is a very inefficient way of achieving well-being. We should be targeting need satisfaction and universal need satisfaction and good ways of running our societies rather than GDP growth. And so that is like, you know, it's very nice when the data vindicates your personal prejudice so nicely. That's how we do science, right? Anyway, so it's just extraordinary, beautiful result and very, very robust. And maybe I'll just tell you, because I feel like telling you stuff, the best demographic profile and the worst demographic profile. You see that's the band. So basically you've got sociodemographics, age, which are age, gender, and relationship status, basically. And those are just systematics. So you have a huge range between the best demographic profile and the worst demographic profile. So that's why Leah did her modeling for the best and the worst demographic profile. And the best demographic profile and the worst demographic profile are remarkably uniform around the world. We're talking about an international data set here. The best demographic profile are older women in families, in couples. They are living their best life. The worst demographic profile, and this is something to really pay attention to, maybe as scientists and sustainability scientists or whatever. Like, I was really shocked and horrified by this, but it just comes out and you see this huge gap between the best and the worst, right? That's just there in the data, is middle-aged men, single. Their lives genuinely suck a lot more than everybody else's. And that's a big problem, and I think we should worry about that a bit. Okay, anyway, that was just a story. Okay, so now I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff, and I'm going to talk a bit about inequality. Okay, well, maybe I won't skip it. I'm just going to say, hopefully you've seen Kate Raworth's donut. Is it possible to have a good social foundation within an environmental ceiling? We tested that in the data. The answer is internationally, no, absolutely not. And things are getting worse. Okay, so that was work by Dan O'Neill and Andrew Fanning mainly. So you can have a look at those papers. But when you're looking at national averages, you know, China, the national average, what does that even mean? You know, the US, like, it means something, but you're hiding a lot of diversity in there. So we also looked at inequality. And so this is one of the results that we had from, so I'm just going to sort of start skipping through things and we can discuss everything later and go into more details if you want. But this is sort of one of the summary slides from what we saw in terms of inequality. We did a lot of work on inequality. These were the PhD theses of Yannick Oswald, looking at it internationally and modeling equality and modeling redistribution and doing all kinds of great stuff. I mean, really extraordinary stuff. And Marta Baltrushevitz, who was looking at inequality at the household level within 4 different countries. She looked at the household level in the UK, which is this result, but she also looked at Zambia, Vietnam, and Nepal, which have beautiful data. And so this is another piece of advice. If you are a researcher and you're starting out doing things or whatever, or you're interested in the next project, there are countries that are completely understudied that have beautiful, beautiful statistical data sets that are available and that nobody is really looking at. So all of these countries that found Zambia, Vietnam, and Nepal, just absolutely gorgeous data, incredible. So not every country has it, but it was quite interesting. Anyway, and so what we see, we're looking at inequality. We're looking at inequality in energy footprints. In this case, it's for the UK. You have the poorest decile at the bottom, the richest decile at the top. And you see the extent. So this is in gigajoules per capita of final energy. And what you see is that housing is super equal, and that's crazy. And so maybe the data is not quite reflecting how unequal it should be, but it's also true that the UK is the worst housing quality in Europe. And what that means is that for the same energy use, poor households that are renting for the same energy use will have a very terrible, thermal quality, and richer households that have enough money to invest in you know, better insulation, so on, we'll get a lot more energy services from the same energy, even they'll be using less energy despite the fact that they're living in a larger space. Okay, but in general, so this is crazy and maybe particular to the UK, but in general, housing energy is very equal. It is one of the most equal form of energy use we see, and we see that also all over the world. So residential energy use is very equal, and where you really see inequality exploding is in transport, and that's true in the UK, but it's true worldwide, and it's true in every country we look at, and it's also true in general. So transport is where things explode, and so you see the flights exploding, you see cars exploding, and the car use, I mean, it's not just car use, it's like more expensive vehicles, driving longer distances, more frequent trips. You know, it's just like transport is just like, that's where green growth falls down and, like, you know, falls off a skyscraper and smashes on the ground. Like you cannot green grow your way out of a system where people are using their disposable extra income on transportation, because transportation is, you know, and especially flights, super hard to decarbonize, very environmentally impactful. So big problem there. And in the UK, it was so much that, it's probably true like in a lot of places, the richest 10% use more energy on flights than the poorest 10% total. So that's upsetting. And we should have some kind of a socialist revolution, I guess. Okay, so then we wanted to look at this question of how would we do things differently? Like, we can see that there's a lot of inequality in the system, and that obviously redistribution would do a lot of things, but we also wanted to see what would allow some countries to live better at lower energy use, like which countries are doing better, what characteristics do they have? And actually, we did this both at the national level and also in these household studies with very much similar findings. So I recommend that you go and look also at Marta's results, but I'm going to show you the results from Joachim Vogel, who did this at the international level. Okay, so basically, this is, I included this plot because this graph, because I'm assuming some of you are a bit more quantitative. Anyway, it's so basically our idea is that we have biophysical resource use, like I showed you, on the one side, human need satisfaction on the other side, and then in the middle, we have these things that we call provisioning factors. They're things that influence the way that country is going to be mediating that relationship. And the way you would show that, remember I showed you that curve of well-being, you know, human development versus energy use. So in that curve, that curve, that's the first thing that's shown, is just sort of what that average curve would look like in a schematic. But basically what is happening with these factors is you're turning a knob. So if you have a high value of a beneficial factor, what you're doing is you're turning a knob such that that curve moves up, and you're achieving much higher well-being at lower energy use. If you have a high value of a detrimental factor, you're basically making the world worse, and you're bringing that curve down. You're making it harder for the countries with that high value to achieve well-being at any level of energy use. So basically what we're doing is we're looking at the provisioning factors as knobs, and there's some knobs that are great and you want to turn them up, and there's some knobs that are terrible and you want to turn them down. And then you've got your machine, you know, the analogy is your society as a machine, and you know which things to turn. Okay, cool. So this is sort of what we found, and this is a result that ended up being quite prominent also in the last IPCC report, which was not my fault, which was nice, is that we found some positive factors. And so some positive factors, public services, it turns out, are massive. This is one of the huge, big findings from our project, is that if you want people to be well at low resource use, you should have great public services. So yeah, healthcare is really important. Equality of income is really important. That does not come as a surprise, since you remember the inequality results. Like more equality means the society being much more efficient. Democracy, it turns out, is a bonus. And anything to do with electricity or sanitation access, so any network infrastructures are good. Also transport infrastructure. So any kind of, I guess that those are sort of, you could think about them as the physical counterpart of public services. Yeah. So those are the good things that we would want more of. And then we also found some factors that didn't matter. So then they don't seem to matter. So I'm not showing them to you. But we have them in the paper. And then we found some negative factors. And one negative factor we found is extractivism. And that's something that everybody knows exists, right? Like this is a very old result in economics. So extractivism means the level to which your economy is reliant on extractive industries like mining or fossil fuel extraction or any kind of sort of, mega cash crop. That would also be some kind of it's basically reliance of the economy on a few extractive sectors. And that's something that's actually known as, it has like multiple names in sort of mainstream economics. It's called the resource curse. It's called Dutch disease. It's called Baumol syndrome, I believe. Anyway, so there's a huge literature on this. A lot of other people have seen it in individual cases, and we just see it at the international level. So that's not a big surprise. But it's, we pick it up. It's very strong. The other thing we saw is that economic growth, so growth-seeking economies that are maximizing economic growth at a level above a moderate income, are also in trouble. They're doing worse in terms of satisfying needs at lower energy use. So that's an interesting result. And that also tells us, what direction do we need to go in? More equality, less growth seeking, fewer extractive industries, lots of public services, and democracy. So that's nice. And then what we did is we tried to do, so this was all sort of existing data, looking at existing countries, existing income classes, existing consumption, all of that stuff. Then we also did a modeling exercise. Well, actually we did a few, but I'm just going to show you one, which is to try to model, okay, we know we have these human needs. We know we have some basic ways of satisfying them, depending on different technologies. What do we end up with in terms of our resource requirements and especially energy requirements of that? So that's what we did, is we tried to model low energy and high well-being future, here shown by people sitting around on terraces, which has to be fun. Okay, so this is based on the decent living energy framework of Professor Narasimha Rao of Yale University. So you should look up his work. He has done and is doing fantastic work on what decent living energy and materials means for specific countries, and what kind of investments are necessary. And what his framework does is it basically takes the same human need framework of Ian Gough and connects it to energy and material, specific levels of energy and material services. And what we brought to it was basically, we just want to model your framework globally. And we're just going to work on that because he was working at specific countries. And so that's what we did. And what we're doing is we're basically saying for each energy service, we're going to take the most efficient technology. But a possible technology, not like an impossible technology. We're not talking about carbon removal, right? We're talking about things that are very much possible. And this results in lower demand. So we have a model. The model takes into account embodied energy as well as direct energy use. It takes into account infrastructure build up. We have a public sector, which maybe is a bit small. The public sector is just schools and hospitals, but there's some public sector there. And there's also some level of private sector in terms of retail space and freight transport. I mean, it's very basic, but it still allows us to get some kind of a decent estimate. So these are sort of the energy services and their level per person, and we can talk about that if you want. Some of them are smaller than they should be. A lot of people focus on the living space, which is 15 square meters per person. That's certainly smaller than a lot of us live in, smaller than where I live in for sure. But one of the things to think about here is that living space is heated or cooled to 20 degrees year round. And that was just a simplification we did because it's a first step in this modeling. We just wanted to get the modeling done. But you don't have to heat to 20 degrees and you don't have to cool to 20 degrees for sure. So if you loosen those, you get the same result with a lot larger surface area. And the other thing is that a lot of our space doesn't have to be heated or cooled all the time. I have rooms that are not heated, like storage rooms or whatever. So anyway, that's something else to think about. Anyway, so it's a basic model, it's a basic estimation. And so this is sort of our summary slide, is what we found is that the global final energy use, so that shows you just look at the plot on the left. So you have global final energy use. This is measured in exajoules, which is a lot of joules. I forget how many zeros. It's a lot, okay? And we're around like, 500, right now around, somewhere between 400 and 500 exajoules of energy. We're sort of, and the International Energy Agency has sort of a reference scenario, and then it has a 2-degree scenario and a below 2-degree scenario. But what you can see is that they're orange 2-degree and yellow below 2-degree scenario, that they're basically just stabilizing global energy use. They're not really trying to shrink it. There was a low energies demand scenario that was done by Arnold Grubler and his colleagues. And they sort of said, listen, with current technologies, we can get down to 250 exajoules. So, and which is our scenario, which is admittedly extreme, right? It's how low can we go and everybody be okay, including population growth. By 2050, gets us down to 160 exajoules roughly. So that's 40% below current energy use despite population growth. So that's pretty good news, but it is an extreme scenario, right? This is like everybody has enough, nobody has any more than that. It's very extreme. There is no room for inequality, and everybody has access to the most efficient technology possible. So I completely admit it's extreme, but it's sort of a frontier. It's a frontier that's interesting to know about. Okay, so then we sort of know what's possible. I guess another thing I should say is that there's a great paper by Jarmo Kikstra, who's at IASA, and so this is he's written lots of great papers. So if you just look for his name, this is a paper that he wrote in 2021, and where he estimated the energy, and he did a bunch of things in that paper. It's really great. But it's one of the things he did is he estimated the energy investment necessary for building up the technology and infrastructure to allow living well at low energy. And I think that this is really important to dispel. There's sort of this idea that reducing resource use is just using less stuff. And that is not true. And everybody's like, oh, we don't need to do anything. We just need to use less. And that is not true. We need to build out a lot of efficient technology and efficient infrastructure in terms of housing mainly. So anything to do with the residential sector in terms of thermal efficiency, heat pumps, induction stoves, all of this stuff. So there's a lot of investment there. And there's also a lot of investment in the mobility sector, like, for electrified public transportation, right? Those are infrastructures and vehicles and so on that have to be built out. So there's a lot of investment to be done. However, that investment is entirely feasible. And that tells us the priority areas of our economy. Like, what should our economy be doing? It should be investing in that stuff, in allowing sufficiency effectively, allowing lower energy use and good access for everybody at a decent level. And when you look at the sectors that currently are being invested in, they are mutually exclusive, which will surprise nobody. Anyway, okay, so that's just an interesting thing. So what is standing in our way? So a good life for all within planetary limits may be technically possible. Cool, that's nice. But we're obviously not heading in that direction. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to understand a bit why, despite the fact that we have this potential of living good lives universally with low energy, why we're not going in that direction. And that means that we have to understand our political and economic system, which is based on power and wealth accumulation. And so this is summarizing quite a lot of research. But one of the things we looked at, we wanted to look at the case of car dependency. And so I was really lucky to be working with these brilliant people. So Giulio Mattioli is a fantastic, really extraordinary researcher in transport. And he and Cameron Roberts and Andrew Brown at Leeds really did this amazing research on the provision of car dependence. How do we understand the creation of car dependence? And that was one of the things that was really interesting, was that what Giulio Mattioli immediately said, the product we need to look at is not the car, the product we need to look at is car dependence. And so we were able to demonstrate what the creation of car dependence looked like. And it was a combination of many things, including the car industry itself, the road industry, the real estate industry. And then they also just sort of organized themselves to destroy public transportation and create a car culture. So that the sort of summary that from our study of provisioning systems is that we have a technical possibility. So provisioning systems could enable good lives at low resource use, but are engineered. I mean, the amount of effort that goes in this is really the core goal of our industrial system, is the engineering of the creation of resource dependency. So provisioning systems are engineered to create resource dependency. And this is coercive. This is not optional, okay? This is not democratic. This is not chosen. This is not consumer choice. This is the creation of coercive resource dependency by industries all over the capitalist world. And in some cases, the non-capitalist world. But and so that's another thing, is one of the things we have to understand is that the dependency on resource intensive consumption is itself an industrial product driven by decades of lobbying, subsidies, and state regulatory capture. So that's depressing, but I think it's really important to understand, and we'll get into that a bit more. We also looked at the case of privatization in the UK, which is super interesting. And I should say that Kate Bayliss, another extraordinary researcher that I was able to work with, has a book coming out like Friday, called Privatizing Humanity, which is a really amazing and summarizes her extensive research into this phenomenon of privatizing essential services, both in the UK and around the world, for instance, in Africa. Okay, so now what are we doing? We're sort of halfway through this REAL project. I already showed you some results from it. There's a lot more. We have a webpage with our publications, so just go have a look at that. There's a lot more coming out. Also, for instance, on labor footprinting, on unequal exchange, on north-south unequal exchange, policy proposals for delinking, for eradicating poverty without growth. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on there. And we have a really strong contribution to Olivier de Schutter, who's the current UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty, on his roadmap for eradicating poverty without growth. So there's a huge amount of work being done on what post-growth policies could look like, both for the global north and for the global south. So I really encourage you to have a look on that. We're also trying to really push this idea of economic democracy. And for that, there's actually also an excellent book by Bertie, Kai Heron, Keir Milburn, and Bertie Russell. So I'll drag that slide up at some point if you're interested in. But we also wrote this this article on democratizing provisioning systems just before their book came out. So we're trying to think about how we organize the economy differently, not just in terms of general like redistribution things, but at the granular level. What do firms look like? What do organizations look like? How do we do the economy differently? Okay, then of course we have to move to you know, we can't just do research anymore because, well, that's not been working so well. So there's a whole bunch of things that have been happening in terms of trying to make the connection between science and activism. A lot of you in this room are doing way more than I have ever done. So I just am throwing that out there. There's a long history of this. For me, the starting point for me was actually Charlie Gardner and Claire Worldley. So I always want to cite them. Scientists must act on our own warnings to humanity. And just last year, Fabian was the main organizer of this workshop, Lorentz workshop in Leiden. And Claire was there, and I can't see you well enough to see if there are other people from the workshop there. But so obviously Fabian and Claire are your main contact points for that. So there's a report that came out called Understanding and Accelerating Collective Climate Action that you might want to have a look at. And I think that, you know, so one of the things we did is we went over the present context of repression and obstruction. There's a lot of criminalization going on around the world, and we're basically seeing a hardening of geopolitical lines, genocide, and attacks on any kind of popular movements and dissidents. Anyway, so we have lots of challenges, to put it mildly. And then there was, I think one of the things that was really positive for me was that basically one of the agreements of the project, and I think it's really vindicated by recent electoral victories of Zoran Mamdani and various advances of the Green Party in England and the UK, is that focusing on well-being and the material reality of people is really important. We have to stop pitting social and environmental goals against each other, okay? And that means that the climate is not the core immediate focus. Climate is a link between it's how we achieve well-being. It's how we contribute to this. And that we have to also create solidarity with things like housing and labor and utility justice struggles. So I think that there's a lot of things there. And we had this discussion of whether or not climate populism is the right term to use, but it's just a discussion. Okay. And so I think we also need to think about strategy. And so this is the last part. So since 2023, I've become 2023 is the time I first learned about the Atlas Network. And it seems like I should have learned about it way earlier. So we're just going to check who in the room has heard about the Atlas Network. All right. It's still way too low. It's horrible. You guys need to learn about this stuff. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about the Atlas Network, but basically there's a whole bunch of research coming out about what the combined, we're not just facing an economic system and a political system, we're facing a system where the strong political players have been making sure that we have a certain economic understanding and a certain economic system that serves them. So it's very much interconnected, and that interconnection happens not magically, not organically. It happens through structures, organization. It's a real sort of quasi-military effort. So this is something that we need to study and understand in its specifics. And these are some of the books I've been reading, which go over what those specifics look like. I recommend all of them. Perhaps for climate people, the most interesting one of the most interesting ones will be Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's The Big Myth that came out, I think, in 2024. It's also been translated into a bunch of languages. And they cover 150 years of industrial lobbying against environmental and social democratic regulation. So it's quite an impressive piece of work. And one of the things that's super impressive is the continuity of that lobbying. So the National Association of Manufacturers in the US was lobbying against the environment and against social measures 150 years ago, and they're still doing it. And they are obviously winning. So, you know, that's something that we need to understand how they organize themselves. Okay. Within this organization, something that came up in the 1950s, well, actually, the Atlas Network came up in the 1980s, but it's a network of think tanks that have sort of similar funding and are coordinated internationally by this thing called the Atlas Network, which is an organization that exists. You can find it online. And what they do, two different things. They push neoliberal economic propaganda and they push climate denial. So they are the main source of climate disinformation around the world. And I was somebody who was researching climate disinformation, and I only learned about this thing in 2023. I must have been living, I mean, but they've been operating remarkably under the radar, which is quite upsetting as well. So the Atlas Network is involved in more than 500 think tanks worldwide, including in Switzerland, including in the Netherlands, including everywhere. And you can find, based on their they had up until 2021, a public repository of all the think tanks and organizations that that were part of them and that they funded and supported. Okay. And this goes all the way back to Friedrich Hayek, who's one of the core figures of neoliberal economic thinking. And Hayek understood that protecting the market mechanism from excess democracy would require the engineering of consent through a political machine, mass marketing, business propaganda. So this is a quote by More Heat Than Life, a fantastic book by Jeremy Walker. This task was taken up by the English businessman Anthony Fisher. So it all started in England. And in 1955, Fisher founded the Institute for Economic Affairs, which later launched the Thatcher Revolution from the far right of the Conservative Party. So he's responsible, he and his think tank, the Institute for Economic Affairs, which still exists, by the way. But there's so many more in the UK. The UK's got like, oh, so many of them. They managed to get Thatcher elected. And that was great because before that, the neoliberal economic project had only been able to be imposed at the barrel of a gun. So in the 70s, there was the coup in Chile, and the neoliberal economic agenda was imposed by Augusto Pinochet. and the Junta, who took over Chile and killed, thousands of leftists and tortured them, whatever, right? And so that was the first place that neoliberal economics managed to happen. Thanks to these think tanks, it then became possible to have neoliberalism through the ballot box. And this is just a picture of Margaret Thatcher and Pinochet, who were in fact really good friends in real life. They'd holidayed together and stuff. So that's nice for them. Okay. So the Atlas Network replicate the materials worldwide. So they're organized, they share materials, they share strategies. Their formula works. Ever since the 1970s, they've been doing the same crap and it works really well. And they're so successful and we really should be so much better at fighting them. So they promote two main things: unequal neoliberal economic policies and climate science denial. They have a few other topics as long as their goal is to stop democracy from being effective. So the constant goal of these think tanks worldwide is to push back against any kind of democratically mandated state intervention, because the neoliberal political project is at its core anti-democratic. It's to protect business from democracy. Okay, that's the main thing. The communicators of neoliberal and climate denial do not care about fundamental values of reality. Their goal is to stop regulation. They care about the strategic outcome of their communication. So if you're a scientist and you're arguing based on facts, you will lose every single time. You have to understand their strategy. You have to understand what their apparatus is and what they're trying to do. You have to expose them, okay? You can't just say, oh, but look, actually CO2 is a greenhouse gas or whatever. That plays straight into their hand. Climate scientists have wasted decades trying to argue on the facts with a political machine that doesn't care about the facts ever. They just care about effectiveness. And so there's always two goals in this Atlas network or neoliberal communication: to create distrust in democratic, publicly oriented or funded processes. So either the IPCC or just university research in general. Actually, one of the goals of the Atlas network is to decredibilize and defund university research, because university research is the public sector brain, right? It's the publicly funded research that democracies can use to make decisions. If democracies don't have a brain, they will make terrible decisions. So creating distrust and undermining university research is a general goal. So that's basically what's going on there in terms of their strategy. In terms of their, one of the things that they want to do in the public sphere is they want to replace university research expertise. They want to influence the influencers, and those include two special target groups: journalists and teachers. So they create public school curricula, especially in economics, especially at the secondary school level. And they also try to shape and recruit and train people who then become journalists. So they always have these freedom summer schools or things like that, where they basically try to find the best young guns that they can then promote into these fields. And another quote by Jeremy Walker: "The work of the libertarian intellectuals and political insiders seeking to capture the policy planning powers of the state must be complemented with a permanent program of mass communication to counter and undermine the sources of the wrong sets of belief." And the wrong sets of belief for them are public universities, public servants, public broadcasters, public scientific institutes. So this is really about undermining the public sphere. Okay. And there's recent reporting that just came out at the end of January, which is just a fantastic article. So just go ahead. And that's a picture of Hayek taking a bull by the balls. Mm-hmm. So it's worth it just for that, obviously. They managed to quote me because I contributed to the Australia, thanks to Jeremy Walker, had this huge Senate inquiry into climate obstruction and climate denial in Australia, finally. And so they were willing to quote, I was quoted in Australia criticizing Swiss media being taken over by the Atlas network. But Switzerland is still the way it is. And who knows what's happening in the Netherlands or wherever you are. It's probably all happening there too. And that's a plea to join the Climate Social Science Network. So the people who are doing the most amazing research on this topic of climate obstruction are the Climate Social Science Network. It's a voluntary network run out of Brown University. And just under the A of scholars, you see the part of the face of Timmins Roberts, my former co-author, lovely colleague, and really the creator of this network. And he's doing fantastic work. And they've published these two different reports very recently: climate obstruction across Europe and climate obstruction globally, a global assessment in 2024 and 2025. So this is quite recent stuff. I would definitely have a look at it. And they're basically, each chapter is looking at a different country or a different sector and really doing very thorough case studies of what the different strategies of climate obstruction are in these different sectors and around the world. And I think that we should really help them out with this. And that was sort of my last point.
Thank you very much for this wide-ranging overview, Julia. I'm sure there are questions. Yes.
Thanks very much. Always very, very interesting. I was wondering something about one of the slides about provisioning systems codependency. You said that provisioning systems are engineered to be codependent and dependent, but I was wondering if it's more that they are financed and financialized in a way that they create this dependency more than engineered to be.
Julia, you're muted, I think.
Yeah. And yeah,
Yeah.
I have also, sorry.
Go on.
I have a part of the question. Also, I was wondering if you still have the list of 2021.
Oh yeah, that exists. You can the list of the 2021 that exists. If you look up DESMOG, do you know DESMOG? DESMOG, DESMOG. No, DESMO. Yeah, DESMOG probably .org. They're investigative journalism outfit, and they've been doing some of the earliest and best work on this. So they have a whole repository page on all their reporting on the Atlas network. And I think Brad DeLong is the main journalist who did this, and he deserves all the credit and all the prizes. Yeah. And in terms of this question of engineering versus financialization, I think this has to do with dynamics of capitalism, right? So basically in capitalism, you have a system that is creating stuff, Marx would call it commodities, in order to achieve profit. So the way that mainstream economics would like to tell the story is that the market allows exchange of commodities. You're exchanging labor for food or whatever. And then you just use market and money as a way to get this exchange to happen nicely. And the way that we understand capitalism and its dynamics are very different is that capitalism uses commodities to make money. So you're starting out with money, you use some commodities, you make more money. And it's a system that has to grow in order to avoid crisis. It is only stable under growth, which means that it is only stable when production increases and consumption increases, which means it is overproductive. And overproductive is a major crisis risk for capitalism. And you could think at the beginning of industrialization, there was enough sort of natural demand for products that people were happy to buy more products, like basic stuff, okay? But after a certain point, people don't want to buy more things. And that's a huge problem for capitalism. So capitalism has had to find ways to create overconsumption proportional to overproduction, or else face crisis. And this is something that is described very well in the treadmill of production theory of Steinberger and Gold, who are two environmental sociologists from the US. So this treadmill of production idea, that does not rely on financialization in its early stages. You're just talking about things like advertisement. You're talking about things like programmed obsolescence, right? Planned obsolescence, where you have a product that, if you made it properly, could last, 100 years, but you make it to fail after 1 year. So you're making sure that you have high throughput. So it is true that the mechanisms for the economic system to create overconsumption proportional to overproduction have moved more and more towards financialization. And actually, another fantastic researcher that I had the great luck to work with, Thomas Haynes Doran, shows how financialization has led to the explosion in SUVs. So I think that financialization is one stage in this, and then there will be other stages. But the general mechanism that this overproductive economic system needs to impose coercive overconsumption one way or another remains generally true. And a lot of that is in fact engineered. So in goods that fall apart, in goods that we can't repair. So that's one of the reasons why the right to repair is actually quite going against this tendency. So there, and also in terms of infrastructure engineering. So the fact that we're creating physical infrastructure that is a commitment to car dependence, to single family home use. This is a great one. In the US, over 90% of the surfaces that are to be built are zoned for single family homes. And that's not because people want to live in single family homes. It's because every single industry that has lobbied to get that regulation passed benefits, which is the car industry, the road industry, and the real estate industry. So this is physical engineering of resource dependence. The same thing with zoning in the US, right? You have a residential zone here, and then you have an industrial zone here, and you have a commercial zone there, and you're creating dependence on cars simply by zoning. So again, the 15-minute city is trying to unengineer that and say we should have infrastructure that allows us to not be dependent on cars. Anyway, so there's both. I should have just said there's both.
Very good, Rosie.
Thanks for the talk, Julia. I'm hoping you can hear me. I'm quite far back. But I wanted to ask about, you had a slide about the provisioning factors that help societies achieve high well-being for low energy use. Could you tell us a little more about how the good ones that enable this are related to each other? So from sort of the perspective of, if there are societies that have a few of these, but not all of them, is it more likely, or what are the patterns in the way they acquire or develop these other good provisioning systems?
So this is, you know, so we're I guess one of the things I should say is that we're doing this research. We would have loved to do it earlier. We would have, you know, a lot of this stuff could have been done like 20 years ago. You know, but we just didn't have the means. We didn't have the financing or the boots on the ground. So this is all like preliminary research still. I mean, we're still in the early phases of this. So in this case, in this research, we only looked at one indicator at a time, one variable at a time. So we weren't able to have the sophistication to look at all of them together. Now, what I would say is that Leah Tamberg's work in the REAL project, looking at the determinants of well-being and also the causal relations of well-being, goes the furthest in the direction of trying to see how these phenomena interact in terms of like what a society would look like that does these kinds of things comprehensively. Yeah, but I don't think that we have the full systemic picture of, you know, how would electricity access enable health access or things like that. That level of complexity we certainly don't have yet.
Thank you.
Maybe Mara and then
yeah, I'm also from the back. I hope you hear me. Thank you so much for this very inspiring speech. And I think it was also very interesting to point it out, like that like the other people are not like working fact-based, and I was still a bit stuck from the slide where you had the worst and best demographics, I think in terms of well-being, and then referring to the group of middle-aged single men. And I was just thinking about how this maybe eventually also links to the concept of heteromasculinity, and then also to, I mean, everything that's now in the in the discussions about like as an extreme version, maybe even incel or the manosphere sphere, and how like I think especially men, like middle-aged white men, are like scared to give up privilege. And I don't have like, it's more like a remark. Maybe you can.
No, I think it's a super important discussion to have, and so these you know, the manosphere and petromasculinity and so on, like these are super important discussions for us to have. But I think one of the things to understand, I think, is that this is a socio-demographic that is very easy prey for these ideas and for these tendencies because their lives suck. So we know we have an epidemic of loneliness. We know that neoliberalism you know, tells us that the market has the solutions, but it takes away the public sphere. It takes away the public spaces where we can interact and hang out with our friends and be valued in non-commercial relationships, you know. So I think that one of the things to understand is like there's partly the giving up of privilege, but there's also the fact that these people's lives these men's lives objectively suck, that they are super lonely, they don't see value or worth in themselves or what they're able to do, and they're also the victims of this economic and ideological system. And one of the things we have to be thinking about is thinking about them in terms of what positive alternatives we propose. So it's not that they're the evil fascists, it's that the fascists are able to win them over because they are also suffering. So I think that we should have room for these different ideas in our minds. And other people are researching and talking about this much better than me. But I think it's not just like they suck because they're bad at giving up privilege. It's also their lives suck, and so they are very susceptible to this kind of toxic messaging.
Hi, Julia. Thank you for the fantastic presentation. At some point, you said that as scientists, we shouldn't come forward with hard facts because then we're playing straight into their plan. And I'm kind of wondering, what do you suggest as an alternative? And what kind of a narrative should we have and ways of approaching the subject, lest we kind of fall into the same playbook that they're using?
Yeah. So I don't mean that we should move away from facts. Like facts are on our side. That's a huge tactical advantage. I mean, come on, like reality is on our side. That's great. So we should definitely make use of that. But I think what the problem is when we're trying to argue, when we're facing a disinformation campaign, the idea that you could win against propaganda and disinformation by arguing on the scientific, look at my atmospheric science model. That's crazy pants, right? That's not going to work. So so the question is, how we need to analyze the So what I would argue is that we need to communicate simply. So when I communicated climate change to my son's classroom when they were like, I think 4 or 5 years old or what, I mean, God, they were small. Actually, I think it was the next door classroom. I think he was with the 6-7-year-olds. But anyway, I was just like, I just brought a globe in with a blanket. And I was like, every time we emit greenhouse gases, we're wrapping another layer of blanket around the globe and it's overheating, because that's what happens when you pile blankets on top of something. Okay, that's simple. You don't have to go into atmospheric physics. You can communicate the scientific reality in very simple ways, and you don't have to make it more complicated than that because reality is on your side. So keep the scientific communication simple and effective. Don't be afraid to oversimplify it. Do the simple thing. And then attack the deniers based on the propaganda. Say, these people are funded by the fossil fuel industry. These people are they know that they're lying because they say different things to different publics. I mean, that's one of the things with the climate deniers. The fantastic previous book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway called Merchants of Doubt, they show that the same people deny the science, deny human origins, deny solutions, but their arguments are not consistent. They change their arguments from one audience to the next. So you have to attack why they're doing it and how they're doing it. You basically have to win that argument, you have to say, this is manipulation. This is not a good faith argument. This is an argument that is being made with the goal of saving the fossil fuel industry, the same way that the tobacco industry ran ads saying tobacco is healthy for you, just so they could, make more profits for a few more years and kill a bunch more people. That's exactly what the fossil fuel industry is doing. Don't argue on the terrain that your enemy chooses for you. That's basic. So it's a lot about communication strategy and exposing them as liars, as propagandists, as corrupt.
Thank you.
Yeah. You kind of touched very briefly on donut economics, and then kind of, from my recollection, sort of said, well, that won't work, and then moved on. And I wondered if I could take you back there, and ask you to expand.
Yeah. No. Everything we do is a version of donut economics. So well-being within limits, that's donut economics. What I was saying is we looked for it at the country level and couldn't find it. So what I was talking about was the empirical evidence. So basically, when we looked to see if any country was within the donut, we found nothing. And so that's why we started looking at what was happening in populations within countries. And then you do see very different things. And you see, for instance, these inequality patterns, and you see what would need to change in order for to get within the donut. So it's not that the donut won't work. The donut, I mean, the donut is sort of like our mission, right, in general. It's how we get there. How do we understand how we get there? And looking at national averages is a very limited way of understanding in the sufficient detail what our socioeconomic systems are doing in order to get into the donut. So everything else was sort of motivated, is like, how do we understand how to get in there? Sorry if I miscommunicated that.
Stephen?
Hi, Julia, thanks so much. This was really interesting, and the discourses of climate delay is forming some of the basis for our project here. So I'm very excited to speak with you. What we're interested in, and what your talk also evoked, is whether there's any, maybe this is an impossible question, but whether there's any research or way to quantify the intentional deception, like the Atlas Network and others, these actors that and to try and put on a spectrum of funded, I know I'm lying, all the way to unwitting actors that are spreading and re-spreading that message because they've bought in or been brainwashed across society. Is there any way we can do that to sort of try and distinguish, I suppose maybe following the money, but yeah, I don't know.
Okay. So I think that's a good question. And it's also not exactly my topic, because I can see what's out there, but I can't, that's one of the things we said in the Discourses of Delay paper, which was a paper that was led by William Lamb and was pretty cool. So have a look at it. But is that these discourses exist whether or not they're intentional. So we didn't go into the intentionality thing. And so one of the things that's very interesting, and she's a fantastic investigative journalist. She runs a podcast called the Drilled Podcast, called Amy Westervelt. And she did, I think it was last year, an entire season on the research of the climate obstruction report. And she interviewed the authors of each single chapter of the climate obstruction report from these reports that I showed you the front page of somewhere it's here. So she interviewed and she had them on the podcast, and there's one, all of the episodes are great. It's so interesting. But one of the episodes that you might want to look at is specifically on this question of intentionality, where some of these researchers are looking at, well, when we look at climate obstruction or climate disinformation or delay or denial, does it intentionality matter? And what was interesting to me is they were basically like, we've stopped caring about that. And you might disagree with them. You might continue to care about that. So I don't want to tell you what to do in your research project, but I think it might just be interesting to have a look at that episode, because it was kind of interesting to me where they were saying, listen, we know that the origin of it is deception. So if somebody then, there's such a great book on this. Okay. If somebody, the originator, let's say the Koch brothers or the Heritage Foundation, is the originator of the deception, and then they train a journalist or a person who writes think pieces, who writes a piece on climate denial or climate delay, or has some kind of product of propaganda, and then some politician then reproduces that because they believe it, they don't know any better. So the intention changes along the chain of production and the chain of repeating of this thing. But the original intent of the people who started it, who started the rumor mill and who organized it, was definitely deception. So maybe it doesn't matter if the person sort of repeating it wants to be deceptive or not. So I just thought it was a really interesting conversation they had. And the book that might be interesting to see, because I think that it has the clearest description of these different layers of deception and propaganda, more on the economic level than on a climate level, is called Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean. And it's the biography of James Buchanan, who is one of the main neoliberal economists. He got the Nobel Prize in economics. Who's ever heard of James Buchanan? Okay, we all live in his world, and his world sucks. So he basically argued against the welfare state. He's got the Nobel Prize in economics for public choice theory. And this guy is fucking evil. He's so bad. I'm sorry. But he went down to Chile for 6 to 7 weeks to write the Chilean constitution with the junta. So he is one of the people who believed in this coercive creation of an anti-democratic economic system via law, via writing it into the Constitution. And in her biography of him, Nancy McLean really talks about these different levels of communication, you know, where Charles Koch and James Buchanan are like chatting back and forth and writing letters back and forth all the time. But then they have these different levels of cadres and organization in terms of getting those ideas out into the world. So you really see like the different, so that might be an interesting place to think about these different levels of, you know, being intentional or being trained or being duped, because they were like, what our goal is will never be popular. So we have to disguise it and we have to create this propaganda machine. And so that's a very interesting account of that, really from the inside. Terrifying.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I hope you can hear me okay. So I wanted to ask you about how we can still defend and sort of advocate for the arguments that we need to live well within limits and that income and well-being are not completely linearly correlated in the light of inflation and shocks and, you know, wars impacting us and energy crisis and food crisis, etc. People's disposable income is diminishing and they are really seeing this relationship between their income and their well-being. And so I think that's the reality of it and we can't deny that. So what is your take on like how do we kind of keep on defending this argument within this like very harsh reality that people are feeling and are, you know, yeah. Sorry, I didn't formulate that super well, but I hope the point comes across. Muted.
You're muted.
I should stop doing that. You formulated it perfectly. And I think I think that this crux of how we communicate it is really important. And you might be interested in this, in looking, for instance, at Olivier de Schuiter's work on so he wrote this book, like, I forget if it's like Eradicating Poverty Without Growth. And he's doing this work on, I mean, he's the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, so really looking at people in deprivation. And the fact is that all the previous special rapporteurs have been sort of forced to say like, okay, well, we need growth to eradicate poverty. And he's like, stop it. We need to stop it with this nonsense already, because growth does not eradicate poverty. Growth goes to profit. Growth goes to inequality. And that's also the work that Thomas Piketty does, right? Is demonstrating that growth goes to the wealthiest and that the wealthiest grow, their economy grows way faster than ours, which doesn't grow at all almost. So I think that we have to first explain like that economic growth and does not in fact help people's material conditions right now under current circumstances because of these unequal dynamics and the way that wealth works and the way that it's then used to make more and more predatory conditions, including via financializations and rent and stuff like that. And I think the other thing we have to do is do this, is do exactly what we were talking about in the Lorenz workshop last year. So maybe have a look at that report. So again, that report is Understanding and Accelerating Collective Climate Action, where we were basically saying we have to focus on material conditions. We have to focus on, you know, everyday people, lower income people, working class people if they're working, or sometimes they're not working. So, you know, really focus on their material conditions. And if you look at Zoran Mamdani, if you look at Zach Polanski, if you look at Hannah, the plumber, they're doing this perfectly. So look at the way that they're communicating this stuff, saying the reality, the material reality of your well-being matters and is a core priority. And it requires all these good things, including climate action. So I think that those would be the directions I would look at.
I think Adam was first.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Julia, for a very interesting and inspiring talk. So I have one question about whether people want to live well within limits. So obviously I'm very sympathetic to it, but you also have a big cohort of especially middle-aged men that kind of rather want to die getting rich, like get rich or die trying, move to Dubai, you move to Singapore, do the grind. And I think they typically become very powerful and they have like this very like job-oriented focus. And I don't think they would really want this. So how do we deal with that challenge?
So yeah, I think that these are super interesting ideas, and also thinking about how different sociodemographics and people who respond differently to influencers. I mean, and the whole Dubai thing, by the way, here it's worth reading Quinn Slobodian and Crack Up Capitalism, because this idea of Dubai and Singapore is central in Crack Up Capitalism. And it's again this neoliberal dream of an economy that does not have a state, that does not have a democracy, and everything works beautifully. And it's a sort of a showcase. It's sort of an advertisement of anti-democratic functioning. And it's deliberately anti-democratic. So it's all got all kinds of problems. So I think it's worth studying these things. And Crack Up Capitalism, I think, is a really important piece of work. It's also super entertaining, actually. The other thing I would say here is that people have very different reactions depending on how you address them. And in this individualized neoliberal society, we're very used to saying, treating people as consumers and talking about consumer choice and being like, hey, you, white man, who lives in Dubai and has a big car, would you want to go and live on an organic, vegan commune and ride a bicycle when it's not being used by somebody else in your vegan commune? And they're going to say, well, fuck no, fuck you. That's terrible. Okay. But that's the consumer choice direction, like individual consumer choice. There are other ways of discussing and deciding, including citizens' assemblies, citizen juries, and also another person who's another great theoretician of human needs, Manfred Max Neef, who had this whole process of human scale development, which are these workshops focusing on human needs and human needs satisfiers, which are at the community level. So if you're interested in this, really have a look at Manfred Max Neef and human scale development, because the idea here is that you bring a community together and you ask them, well, what are your current needs? How do you currently satisfy them? What's working? What's not working? How would you want to do things differently? And people really collectively come up with very, very different visions and plans. And that was also my experience within citizen juries and citizen assemblies. I remember the lead citizen assembly, which is or citizen jury, which is the one I spent a bit more time with. They oversampled for climate denying people. So there would be at least 3 of them in the room or whatever. And they were these older guys, right? And because they were in this setting where everybody was listening to them and respecting their point of view, but also exchanging with them, also pushing back a bit, and they really were part of this community effort to try to advance together. They got on board remarkably fast, and they were like, vegan, organic bicyclists by the end, basically. So it was. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but I think that it's really important how we include people and how we interrogate them, and give them a chance of not just having agency over their lives, but having agency over their lives as a part of a community. That makes a huge difference. Like interrogating people as citizens, part of society, makes a huge difference as opposed to interrogating them as consumers and lifestyle, seekers.
Wait, there's two quick last ones, Anne? Yeah.
Hi, Julia. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. So I'd like to go back to science communication. And I am wondering how to deal with those results that seem to be super frustrating and that don't have a hopeful message at all. For example, you showed us that graph with like how people, how sufficiently people could live. And you framed it as this is not a realistic setting at all, most probably. And I feel like with framing things in that way, which is probably the realistic way to frame it, we really like weakening these results with like not making them an option to really like make them realistic at one point. So I'm wondering how to deal best with those.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to propaganda. I'm not trying to do propaganda. I'm obviously talking to scientists, right? And I think that I do want to say that it is an extreme result because it is a frontier result. Like it's how low can you go? We can definitely go in that direction. We can go. I mean, I wouldn't say that we want to go in the direction of radically decreasing energy use. Maybe we won't cut it by 60%, but maybe we can cut it by 50%. That's already a lot more. So I guess that it's not saying that, I'm just saying that particular value is probably unattainable. Something on that order of magnitude is definitely plausible. So maybe I should have said that. I'm not the person for optimistic communication anyway. That's not what I do. You should do that. You should go do that.
Is there one final question from Claire?
Julia, have you read that paper about how the maths works? So eventually the degradation of all of the wealth of society, including knowledge, but also, but especially material things, that the breakdown outstrips growth so much that if you still keep the growth system, then inflation just goes kind of vertical and the whole thing's fucked. And they think that either happens depending on how things play out in the 2030s or towards the 2060s. Have you read that? And do you think that, because it seems quite important to me, as an addition to the conversation, do you feel, although a lot of people are not swayed by sort of information or being proved wrong, that the mathematical basis of some maths that says maths will destroy maths because of the real world, that there's something useful in that and the reflection on inflation? Because I often think that the conversations lack the kind of jargonistic focus that actually economics loves, like talking about how inflation works or talking about how the sort of made up systems work.
Okay, so I have not seen that paper, so please send it to me. So I don't want to speak in ignorance. What I have seen that I find compelling is Jess Abrams' compilation of how basically current economic models are completely not just that they're not trying, they're fundamentally incapable of representing the kind of changes in extremes and in structural changes that we would either see through because of climate change impacts or other planetary effects and tipping points, or I would argue from a degrowth perspective, they're also incapable of representing the kind of change we want that would be positive. And so I have a lot of skepticism around these kinds of long-term projections, because we know that GDP is the wrong indicator. We know that the kind of models we have in mainstream economics are very, very bad at representing any kind of big or structural change. So we need that's one of the things we're working on in the REAL project. We're not there yet in terms of showing what that kind of thing looks like, but hopefully we'll get some of the way, is that we need to be able to think about big changes in the economy. So if somebody's basically, I don't know, I think that it's just, I would have a lot of skepticism for models that rely too much on mainstream techniques, because mainstream economics assumes lots of crazy things like equilibrium and stability and well-functioning markets and just like really weird stuff. Yeah, so I think that, yeah, anyway, maybe that's just, I think that Jess Abrams and the team at Exeter did a really good job in sort of explaining why mainstream economics and their current assessments and models are just terrible. So that came out last year. So I'll send that to you and you send me your paper and then we discuss.
Excellent. I think that's a great way to end, Julia, with corporate collaboration. Thank you so much for your time.